everyone. Welcome to today's session. What could we achieve if the 1% gave 10%? In today's session, we'll be talking about if the world's wealthiest 1% gave 10%, how we could raise $3.5 trillion per year. And we ask the question, with those resources, could we solve some of the world's most pressing problems? Our presenter today will be Finn Moorhouse. Finn is a researcher at Longview Philanthropy and previously a research scholar at Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute. During today's session, you can enter questions and comments in our live chat and swap card, and we'll be discussing those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Finn.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Rocky. So I wanted to talk today about, I guess it's quite ambitious. There's quite a lot here, but the general vibe is that there are some really big problems in the world, but we already just have some really good ideas for how to not just kind of chip away at the edges of them, but maybe just solve them, or at least get quite a long way towards solving them. And I'll talk about this framing of whether we could actually just start doing that if we were to raise a lot of money, such as through the richest 1% giving 10%. But first, I thought I'd start with some history just to set the scene. So the guy you're looking at now, he's called Norman Borlaug. You might recognize that name. The context here is that I guess around the late 50s, early 60s. So the world's population was rising at quite a steady clip. And some people were very worried that the food supply, the world's food supply, wouldn't be able to catch up, such that maybe the world was just heading towards this quite unavoidable mass food shortage, which could lead to a bunch of famines. That would be very bad, to be clear. But decades earlier, so just after the war, philanthropists in partnership with governments had started funding research into how to improve crop yields in especially difficult conditions. And this guy, Norman Borlaug, was leading a team that ended up breeding these strains of especially disease-resistant and very high-yield varieties of wheat. And eventually the seeds were distributed first to South Asia, later to Africa and the rest of the world. And long story short, global cereal production tripled over the next 50 years or so. And obviously, unfortunately, famines are still with us, and so are food shortages. But we didn't get the kind of apocalyptic predictions that some people were worried about. And I think that's just a really incredible and underrated example of progress. And it was spurred initially by philanthropic spending, people and government spending, but really just people caring about finding solutions early on. And really, it was just to the tune of $100,000 a year or so, initially from the Rockefeller Foundation in the 40s. So I thought, that's quite a cool example of philanthropy achieving something just very meaningful at a kind of global scale. But there are so many other examples, kind of too many to go into any detail about. But we have her in the top left. This is Catherine McCormick. She was a philanthropist who funded basically the development of the first oral contraceptive pill for women in the 50s, after pharma companies, I guess, kind of pushed it aside because it didn't seem especially profitable. We have the example of golden rice in the top right. This again was spurred by philanthropically funded research. This is rice that's rich in vitamin A, which is a very commonly deficient micronutrient, potentially just saved millions of lives. We have the example of the pugwash conferences in the bottom left, and they led, maybe not exactly directly, but I think they really meaningfully contributed to what eventually became the Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And then finally, we have this amazing fundraising effort from the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, I think, just from tens of millions of Americans raising funds, which eventually funded Jonas Salk's polio vaccine. And so many more examples beyond that as well. But what are the lessons here? I think maybe there are two we can kind of draw out. The first is that, there, like I said, there are very big problems in the world, but we just already have so many examples of really just coming some way to solving them, right? These are like real macroscopic changes and not just little incremental changes. And secondly, it seems like, at least in many cases, philanthropic spending, in addition to government spending and private spending, of course, but philanthropic spending seems like it can be instrumental. It can make those changes happen, or at least make them happen much earlier than they otherwise would have happened. So here's the kind of framing question. It's this question of what could we do if we're looking forwards, right? Kind of inspired by these examples, we want to see what else we could do in the future. That's going to require some money. So where might that come from? Here's a suggestion. It's kind of simple. So what if the wealthiest 1% in the world gave 10% of their income or 2.5% of their net wealth per year, whichever is higher? Well, first of all, how much would that be? Surprisingly hard to work out, but our best guess is something like $3.5 trillion per year, and that would be over and above the money which already goes to charity of some kind, which seems to be in the ballpark of about $1 trillion per year globally. So $3.5 trillion, that's what we have to play with. And I think just for the next few slides, I'm just going to like rattle through a bunch of examples of really ambitious, scalable things that you could spend that amount of money on. I will quickly note, if you're making more than 60K a year and you don't have dependents, then you're in that 1%. It's a, I think, surprisingly broad group, and I expect many people, maybe even watching this talk, will be in it. Okay, so here's a kind of very quick overview. Some of us at Longview were thinking about this question recently, and we came up with some ideas. The enormous caveat is that this isn't like some prescriptive, oh, we figured out the best way to spend $3.5 trillion. This really is just, I think, the purpose here is one of inspiration. But okay, so let's rattle through some stuff. I'll miss stuff. I'll miss out important details, but you know, that's what you do in a 20-minute talk. So start with extreme poverty. So still about 1 in 12 people in the world live below the extreme poverty line, which is set at $2.15. And that's importantly adjusted for purchasing power. So it's what $2.15 it's the purchasing power that would have in the US. And I'll just single out one intervention here, which is especially scalable, although of course there are many. And that is direct cash transfers. And I think that's best embodied by Give Directly, which is an organization which does them. The findings from cash transfers are just really promising. So there's just the obvious case, which is, you know, you enable people to buy more and to improve their lives quicker. But also there seems to be this kind of functional doubling of the effect of the initial transfer, because people tend to save and earn more after they get a one-off transfer. Also, there are these spillover effects on consumption to non-recipients, right? So for instance, to a household. And finally, you might worry about price inflation, right? So if you just make everyone in a country twice as rich, then maybe that just means that all the prices double and nothing's changed. The kind of early signs seem to be quite promising that price inflation isn't as big a worry as you might fear. So all in all, this just seems like enormously scalable. And some kind of napkin math suggests that for something like $260 billion, we could prevent or could ensure that no one lives below that extreme poverty line for a year. And then, of course, hopefully there would be these longer run effects also. Okay, let's talk about pandemics now. Again, there are just so many concrete things to be done on reducing the risk of a pandemic. I won't spend my time explaining why it would be good to reduce that risk, but it would. But some things that we could do. So one thing is we could set up a screening program, for instance, to track sewage and wastewater for very early signs of a new potential pandemic. And that way we could raise the alarm sooner than otherwise and stop it before it goes pandemic. Could also just upgrade existing lab facilities worldwide so we can get a new vaccine to everyone who needs it within a space of months. I think COVID showed how that was possible, although I think we can really improve on that. We could stockpile just a very effective PPE to cover basically all the essential workers in the world, not just in rich countries. And also something I'm very excited about is we could invest in ways to improve indoor air quality. So for example, with germicidal lights. this could just kill viruses, including pandemic potential viruses, in the air before we breathe them in. So again, so many things to be done, and things which could absorb ultimately, I think, tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars if we wanted to. Next one is climate. I guess I don't need to say that it's a big deal. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that even before accounting for climate change, as in warming and all the environmental effects that follow from that, air pollution alone, just making outdoor air dirtier, seems to cause more than 3 million deaths a year, and that's more than all murders, war, and terrorism combined. So air pollution alone is a big deal. And I think, one lesson when you look at climate is that you can make a big difference through spending money, especially when compared to behavioral changes like reducing consumption or switching to more environmentally friendly products, even though those things are just robustly great. This is a very kind of, I think, ballpark estimate, but here's just a comparison between the effectiveness of spending on, I believe, kind of policy advocacy type work in the climate space. And that's a good thing because I think we have quite a long way to go. This is I guess, a visualization of how far we need to go to meet the Paris Agreement. I don't know how optimistic I am, but I think we can do a lot better, let's say. And one reason I think for optimism about the potential to do well on climate is that clean energy tech has really gotten a lot cheaper over even the last decade or so. Know that this graph isn't on a log scale. So that's nearly 1,000-fold decrease in the price of solar over just a few decades. And I think the same goes for batteries. So the price of batteries has declined by more than 97% in the last 3 decades. And these are trends which could just totally continue if we wanted them to. And if we put a bunch of effort and resources into continuing that R&D and replacing out our energy infrastructure with clean alternatives. And then there's also other things we could do. So we could think about carbon capture and storage. We could even, that is kind of taking carbon from point of emission, even from the air. One very cool approach you might want to look into is this idea of using this mineral called olivine, which reacts with CO2 just to form this kind of silt, which is basically harmless. And it's very cheap to make this stuff. You just grind up a certain kind of rock. So lots to do on climate. Again, could absorb a ton of money. Let's talk about nuclear now as I continue my whistle-stop tour. I guess there's a lot here. The only thing I'll say on nuclear is it's quite scary how little is currently spent on nuclear weapons policy. That is philanthropic spending on reducing the risks from nuclear war directly. A major funder pulled out recently in the last couple of years from the space. And that means that currently it's less than $50 million being spent per year. I tried to figure out how much we spend on novelty socks per year. And I think we spend more on novelty socks than we do on reducing the risks from nuclear war currently. But so I've got the $6 billion figure here. And the idea there is that if you spent this much as an endowment, then just from the returns, you could quadruple philanthropic spending on nuclear security, just in perpetuity. Let's talk about AI. Might have heard of it. Again, I think the philanthropic spending that's targeted at making advanced AI, so the kind of AI that we don't have but could have soon, that's targeted at making that safe, is quite small, and I think wouldn't be so hard to scale up. In fact, I think $1.5 billion per year would scale it very roughly by 10x, last I checked. And again, there are just so many concrete things to be spending money on. For instance, mechanistic interpretability work. This is just like very kind of nascent field of study where I think it could just absorb a lot more talent. And also, could use a bunch of compute as well. And a bunch of other stuff, mentorship programs, policy work, evals projects. The list goes on. I think I'll pass over this slide, but this is try to give me a sense of how imminent the problem could be. And also just to visualize the relative spending from nonprofits versus, or philanthropic funding versus the for-profit funding. You need another 10 slides to get to the top of that orange bar on the left. And it's a similar story for researchers, at least when this graph was made, which was maybe a year ago or so. And just to visualize that amount of money in the total pie, it's really not very much relative to everything else. So I think you can make a huge difference here on what is just clearly one of the most important issues of our time. With not so much money and talent, I think there are, well, talent seems like a real bottleneck as well. Okay, barreling on. I think that safe drinking water and hygiene more generally is one of these topics that often gets passed over, but it's a very big deal. About 1 in 3 people in the world don't have access to a safe source of drinking water, or a source of safe drinking water, I should say. And unsafe water kills over 1 million people per year. And again, there are just some really concrete kind of scalable projects here. Just building toilets, building plumbing, hand washing stations, and eventually just building out the full infrastructure that you need to deliver piped water to more communities. This is where the areas that unsafe water affects most. And somehow I've skipped right to the end. So there's some spoilers. I should probably speed up a little bit. So I'll maybe pass over some things, but I was going to talk about hunger and malnutrition as well. I think one untreated thing here is that a lot of the health burden from hunger and malnutrition, especially in stunted growth, comes from specifically just deficiencies in micronutrients. So it's not just total calories, but it's just things like not getting enough iron or zinc or vitamin A. And these are problems which are almost kind of, it's almost kind of sad how easy they are to remedy, or at least how cheap they are to remedy. So for instance, through supplementation, like through multivitamin pills, food fortification, so just like adding nutrients to something like wheat that people are going to be buying anyway. Also, what's called biofortification. And so that's, for instance, I mentioned golden rice. So it's cultivating crops to increase the levels of important nutrients. An example of VOGs here are orgs like Helen Keller International, Iodine Global Network, and also Fortify Health. And the kind of just the unit economics are really just very cheap per person once you have these things scaled up and integrated, for instance, with governments. There's also, obviously a very big issue of, well, there's a lot going on with giving women control over reproduction and reproductive health. So a very obvious reason this matters is about 800 women die every day from pregnancy-related causes, and more children as well. And that's just a fixable problem. So you could just fund antenatal care visits and just improve basic hygiene practices, get more support staff. Another issue which I think is just really valuable here is expanding access to contraceptives, where this just means that you get more control, obviously, over your family, but also can prevent deaths from unsafe abortions, for instance. And an example of an org here is family empowerment media. Skip over this slide for time. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster, but I'm happy to, I guess, go back to some of these slides and talk about details. Next 2 slides are on diseases, especially in the global south. So I guess it's often called the big 3. So TB, HIV, and malaria. Together, they kill about 2.5 million people per year. But we've actually made a bunch of progress. So since 2000, seems like more than 50 million lives were saved through TB just testing and treatment. And I think one thing we could do in addition to that is fund next generation vaccines for TB, which seem kind of amazingly neglected so far, given how many lives they could save. It's a similar story for malaria. So malaria has been eradicated from about half the Earth's surface since 1900, mostly through insecticide spraying campaigns. But I think we could just go all the way and more or less eradicate malaria. One example is making more progress on vaccines. We only got the first approved vaccine for malaria a couple of years ago, about a century since the parasite was discovered and its mechanism was understood. Also, there's this idea of a CRISPR gene drive to extinct the malaria-carrying species of mosquitoes. And it's a similar story on HIV as well. WHO, the UN has this estimate that we could end HIV as a public health threat for about $30 billion. And it's a similar story for tropical diseases, although I'll skip over that for time. And the final example here is factory farming, where it's quite hard to wrap your head around the scale of just the number of animals which are slaughtered for food every year, or otherwise involved in industrial farming. About 50 billion chickens will be slaughtered for food this year. That means that, so let's see, in the next 2 years, roughly, more chickens will be slaughtered than all humans who have ever lived. And also just by biomass, farmed animal livestock alone outweigh all humans and also all wild mammals by more than 15 to 1. So I don't know to explain why this is not good. Maybe one observation though is just to kind of it's also just very inefficient. So in the UK, animal food products are about 10 times more land intensive per calorie than plant-based foods, and also they just take up in total about 85% of the land used for agriculture in some way. That includes growing the crops to feed the animals. But here again, we just have these solutions which we could just massively scale through more funding and through more people entering the field. And a really obvious example is the example that I believe Bruce was talking about in the previous session, which is developing protein alternatives that are taste and cost competitive with animal proteins. And that way you're not just relying on, moral persuasion alone. You're just building a product or getting a product which people prefer on its own grounds. And here's a kind of zoomed out picture of some numbers. Although the thing to emphasize here is, of course, this is not again, we haven't figured out the best way to spend $3 trillion. This is just a kind of idea of the kinds of things you could achieve, the kinds of problems you could really get to work on with this amount of money. And then just to begin wrapping up, we'll go back to this kind of original slides where I kind of wanted to convey two ideas. One was that just time and time again, it turns out that these really big problems in the world can be solved. And that's not to minimize how big they are before they are solved. But I think it's a reason for optimism about just being able to make progress on them. And that requires a lot, though. So it's not just money, right? It's also actually having people to find the solutions to the problems and to cooperate with one another and to eventually deploy them. And that's something I really want to emphasize. Money doesn't have in itself some magic power to go and solve problems. Money is an enabler of people to fix problems. I think that's quite important to bear in mind, because I don't want to convey this picture that, if only you were a billionaire or a gazillionaire, then you just kind of, spend however many $1 billion on, let's say, getting another vaccine for TB or something like this, and then it just instantly happens. It's a enabler for a much, much bigger thing. And it's not like you can just press a button to solve problems. That's not how it works. And I think that's important if you're watching this, because I don't want to also give a sense that you can't do anything if you're not incredibly rich. Actually, I think the important thing is joining projects which can absorb the money and do amazing things with it. And then a final point is that in almost every area you look, money faces diminishing returns, which means that, let's say the first $10,000 might do as much good as the next 100,000, as the next million. So getting in early can be a really big deal. And you don't need to kind of think that, oh, I'm not going to be able to make any difference because this field is currently quite small. Actually, the opposite. And I'll just finally say that if you're interested in learning more about this, my colleague at Longview, Natalie Cargill, gave a talk on this same question. It's much better than the one I just gave. And I can share a link to that. Or I think you just Google that and you'll find it. And then also we put together this report, which has a bunch more kind of numbers and workings on the things that I said. And that's everything. So sorry for going over on time a little bit, but thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Finn. That was super information packed and inspiring. And we already have a number of, I think, very thought-provoking questions coming in the chat, and people can continue adding more questions there as well. So the current most upvoted question, how much do the 1% currently give, and what are they currently funding?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I need to probably go back to my notes to give an answer that I'm going to be confident in. And I'd be happy to actually follow up on that if anyone's interested. The high level thing I'll say is so around $1 trillion, it seems, goes to charitable causes per year. I believe that most of this comes from, let's say, the richest 20%, although I'll actually need to check that. If you look at charitable giving as a fraction of income across countries, it actually surprisingly doesn't really correlate much with average income, if that makes sense. So as people get richer, it doesn't seem like they give significantly more. And in fact, there are countries with pretty low average incomes that are giving a lot more than a lot of rich countries. In terms of where the money currently goes to, it's just obviously a big mix. A lot of it goes to so I think like church donations and donations to other organized religions, that counts in this bucket. So at least a decent fraction is that. A lot of it is just the kinds of things you would expect, like local organizations. Let's see. Yeah, I think I need to go back to the source to really say anything more concrete than that, but I could do that later.
Great, thank you. We also had a question thinking about the difference between income and net wealth. And this feels timely, I know, giving what we can. Just created a new pledge option where people can pledge based off of their net wealth rather than annual income. And curious how Longview thinks about that, and also if potentially the 1% giving 1% of net wealth rather than income might actually lead to a greater sum being donated each year.
Yeah, totally. It's a really good question. And the reason I mentioned it was, so I think just for most people, even most people in the 1%, 10% of your income is probably going to be more than 2.5% of your net wealth. But for people who are very wealthy, so, deca millionaires and above, I think often it's the case that most of your wealth accumulation, in some sense, just comes from returns on your existing wealth, rather than getting paid an income by some employer. I think it's often the case, for instance, that you get some kind of nominal income from your work, but you also get a lot of investment returns and so on. And so I think it's quite important to be tracking that as well, because otherwise you're kind of missing the very high net worth individuals, but most of their net worth is in their wealth, which is often growing, but not in some kind of nominal income they receive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And maybe kind of following up on that, there were a few questions about engaging in this space. One of them is noting that a lot of people are very hesitant to donate money generally, and certainly 10% of their income. And so any, I guess, tips or tricks that you have on encouraging people to donate. And then maybe related to that, There's a question regarding what you see as the gaps in the philanthropy space currently. So for someone starting out in the field, what are the most impactful spaces within the philanthropic sector?
Yeah, great. So the first question was something like, people are hesitant to give 10%. Anything to say about that? And I think one thing I want to say actually is that, um, I don't want the overall message of this talk, um, to be that, oh, you should definitely give 10% if you're in the 1%. I think it's a really great thing to consider seriously, and I'd love to be in a world where more people are doing it. Um, but I think, actually, it's probably just not a sensible option for many people in the 1%. Many people are, supporting other people, or just for any reason. Um, it would be quite difficult to give that amount, and maybe they would be better if they care about having an impact on the world. Um, Better using their time in some way rather than their money. I think that's just totally fine. I think, um, I wouldn't want to kind of create some sense of uh, obligation in that sense. Um, and I think it actually is the case that for maybe most people watching this, uh, if you are able to focus your career on some of the things I talked about or other things, I think you could end up having much more of an impact through that rather than through your donations. Although, of course, your donations are supporting other people, so there's a limit. And then the second question was something like, where are the gaps in philanthropy or something? That's a good question. I suppose, to some extent, that's like a big question of EA in general, right? It's trying to figure out what are those gaps and how can we improve on them. In terms of actually just, what are the missing things for a potential donor? I do think that there's a lot of information that is missing. This was a question that was noticed by, GiveWell very early on, right? Where if you're a donor, you might want to really know what your money is exactly doing per dollar. But most of the time, this is quite hard. And a nonprofit is not compelled to transparently report on their activities, on how much they cost. And so I think a lot of the time it's kind of concerningly vibes based. And I feel really good about more things like GiveWell. You could actually imagine charity evaluation happening not just in the global health space, but so that there are some orgs working in the animal space as well. But even more generally, I think I'd love to see more GiveWell type transparent charity evaluation work. And I should also say I think it's great that there are independent organizations doing the evaluations rather than a system where we rely on the recipients of donations themselves to come up with cost effectiveness numbers or paint a story of what they're doing. One reason for this is it's actually just quite onerous to produce a bunch of reports on everything you do as a nonprofit, especially when you're small. So it's good that the evaluation orgs are taking some of that burden and saying, give us your kind of raw information, and then we'll prepare reports and we'll try to compare it with other things and we'll try to kind of paint a balanced picture. So I feel good about more of that kind of thing. But yeah, there's so much more to say about what's missing in philanthropy, right? It's like such a big thing.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and we've got quite a range of questions, so I think I'm going to ask you questions about giving more broadly, then giving versus some other potential ways of doing good in the world, and then maybe we can get to the questions that are about, I guess, a kind of like cause-specific areas of your presentation.
Yeah.
So on the giving more broadly end of things, there's a question asking if there's a way for us to engage churches in effective giving. And I think this is something that comes up for people in the effective altruism community a lot in terms of I guess that is obviously a place a lot of people have strong ties and where there's strong influence, and also where a good sum of charitable dollars are currently going.
Yeah, man, that's a good question. And yeah, I think more broadly, one thing I've noticed is that when people are thinking about giving, maybe it's kind of near the middle or end of their career and they want to give back in some way. Um, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is giving back to some organization that they benefited from. And very often that's like one's, your alma mater or your is that how you pronounce it? Or a religious organization that you were part of, or even your school. Um, and I think often, those are attitudes which could be amenable to some conversations about where else might that money go to. It's not always obvious to me that um, a new wing named after you or something is the best way to spend money. Um, but then there's another side of the question, which is that so the example was churches, right? And churches themselves will often raise a lot of money and then give it. Um, there are also, there are organizations which are specifically sponsored by churches operating elsewhere in the world. And I guess I don't really have very interesting things to say here, other than, one, I think insight from effective altruism is that there are much better and worse ways to spend charitable money, and I think that insight applies to, um, you know, uh, any organization which is kind of open to it. And I expect that organizations which have more specific ties to, um, to be funded by a church, for instance, will be open to that as well. So I'm kind of rambling, and I feel like I don't have much interesting to say here, but it's a good question.
Yeah, no, and I think it's definitely kind of an underexplored area. So
Mm,
yeah, I think rambly thoughts are probably a good prompt for further discussion.
mhm.
Um, yeah, there. So we had the question earlier about where people are currently giving, and then I think this is an interesting kind of follow-up to that. I'll read this question in full. How do you estimate how the top 1% are currently using that $3.5 trillion? Do their other donations, investments, purchases contribute to global economic growth and do some good for the world, even if it's far from optimal? How do you account for that opportunity cost of the 3.5 trillion?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, I think in short, the answer is yes. So to like massively overgeneralize, I think it's probably fair to say that if you're considering very high net worth individuals, so 1% of the 1%, um, the money which would otherwise be donated in this kind of thought experiment would likely either be spent on consumption or would be invested, would just be saved. And when money is being saved, right, typically it's not just being stored under a mattress, but it's being invested in some fund, which ultimately is going to end up in some productive company which produces returns, right? Um, and so it is true that saving money is in some sense um, contributing to the economy and causing growth. And that is, if you think growth is a good thing, then which I think on the whole it is a good thing, then that's an effect that you need to consider. And I think it's easy to imagine actually if you're facing some choice between creating some for-profit company which is just producing something that people really care about, like let's say Tesla or something, right? Has all these positive externalities, it's causing a bunch of innovation, or you want to spend that money on some kind of random philanthropic venture, like creating a big, art museum named after you or something. Actually, I think that the for-profit thing would maybe be better for the world in that case. So that to say, it's a good question. But I think there is a reason to think that you could just beat the good you would do in investing your money just in the market. Um, and that is that almost kind of by definition, the market is not pricing externalities, right? Um, and so that's where you're going to expect to get these real neglected areas where you could produce more benefit than your kind of dollar number would suggest. And one way to look at this, well, there's a few ways, but one is how much, just in the short term, how much good are you doing from just giving someone in your country, if it's a rich country, $100 versus in a very poor country? And the answer is you're probably doing more good in a very poor country, just because money goes a longer way there. But also you can do more, you can do even better than just giving money directly a lot of the time, at least kind of on the margin, because you could donate to these global health charities, which are doing these things where there's no market that exists for it, even in the countries which they're benefiting. And then you can kind of zoom out even further, and you can see that, for instance, animals just don't have any, aren't able to participate in any market, and so any externalities which fall on them not being priced. And I think the same applies for just the entire future, which is a pretty big place. And so I think there are these like fairly principled reasons to expect that you can do a lot more good outside of just investing in the market. In terms of like putting numbers on how much more good, happy to like I guess talk more about that later. But I think I need to go and make sure I'm not making stuff up and go and look at the numbers again.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I guess kind of tied to that, there was a question noting that with certain issues, for example, the rights of women, or you touched on like access to reproductive technologies during your presentation, that a portion of the 1% doesn't necessarily agree with providing that sort of access. And I guess kind of tying into the larger question of, okay, are there things outside of just giving that we should focus on? Yeah, I guess any thoughts you have on that, and maybe ways that certain issues are going to be more challenging to solve because of the larger social dynamics at play.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a very good point. And one thing I just didn't mention at all is how social change feeds into this, where I think just looking back over history, right, a lot of what we now describe as big problems, which have been solved, or at least which we've made significant progress on, that didn't primarily, or certainly didn't just come from some people spending money and then generating these more kind of technological solutions, but also from people changing their minds and from society and culture changing. Enfranchisement of women or attitudes towards slavery come to mind as examples, but there are like obviously a ton. There I'm just going to say like, yeah, that's just like a very good point. And there's a whole lot to say about it. One thing you could do is, if you think some issue is important and underrated, is you could fund advocacy, right? As an attempt to bring people around to a point of view which you think is a good one. So I think, take animals as an example, right? I think it's just the case that most people maybe just haven't considered the scale of the problem when it comes to industrial animal farming. And maybe you can make some headway through not just kind of building the alternatives to animal products, but also to kind of changing attitudes more generally. That is a very, I think that question of like, how do you change attitudes in the long run, that I find like a very interesting and very big question, not one I'm really placed to say anything especially interesting about, but I'd love to know more about it.
Great. Yeah. And that actually segues really well into one of our most recent questions, asking if you have any thoughts on why philanthropy or altruism is so obvious to some people and not to others. And I'll plug that I think the EA Psych Lab group has done some really interesting research around this. But yeah, curious, I guess, also how Longview is thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see. I think one thing that at least I have noticed, I guess not speaking for kind of Longview more generally, but there's this idea which you come across in effective altruism, right? Which is this kind of abstract idea of trying to help them, as many people as you can, or trying to do as much good in some abstract sense as you can. And I think once you spend enough time kind of swimming in that water, then it begins to feel quite obvious. Like, good is just good by definition. And so surely, I should be trying to do as much of it as possible. Um, but I think it's important to realize that like that's not an idea that you're born with. And I think when people approach philanthropy, I do think that's synonymous with people thinking, how can I do as much good as I can with my spending? I think often people have other things in mind, and that's kind of fine. Like people might be thinking more about, especially very wealthy individuals, might initially be thinking just in terms of, how can I leave a legacy? Um, you know, or how can I give back in a very kind of direct sense, to the like specific institutions which helped me, like I mentioned earlier. And it takes some, I think, just reflection to kind of to get that more abstract sense of just doing the most good, for that to feel really intuitive. Yeah, and what else? I think also there's just a big this is just the kind of classic EA observation, but there's this problem of scope neglect, right? Where when you don't have incentives built in to notice the different scales of problems, then actually it's something you need to proactively do, is to notice that, this problem is 10 times as big as the other one. But again, that's not entirely natural, right? To kind of really compare the numbers. And so there's more of an attitude, I think, often of just kind of getting a gut level feeling and not really kind of adding to that with trying to compare scales. So again, some kind of rambly thoughts. A lot of them I think are just like very standard, the kind of thing you'd read in Doing Good Better, but I think those are most of them.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, in the final minutes we have left, we did have a few questions on particular parts of the presentation and some, I guess, cause-specific questions. You'd noted that there was a nuclear safety policy funder who pulled out, and people are wondering more details on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me check I'm getting the name right, because it's been a while. Because I don't want to mention a foundation and then accuse them of stopping funding, and then it wasn't them. Let's just see 1 second. I believe it was, yeah. Sorry, I'm actually blanking on the name, and I'm a bit wary of saying my best guess and then realizing it was wrong. So in the office hours, I will actually check this. But they were about half the size of the space. And my understanding is that, so they withdrew either last year or a couple of years ago.
I believe it was the MacArthur Foundation.
I was going to say MacArthur. I was like 80% sure. Thanks, Rocky. It's the MacArthur Foundation. And yeah, I think that they didn't feel like they were making really tractable progress in the programs that they were funding, in the sense of they weren't really seeing results come up. And so they decided to, I think, close down a bunch of their programs. I can't speak to more details than that. I think, maybe there was some, yeah, I can't speak to how reasonable that was, but it does just mean that there's a much bigger opportunity now in the space than there was even a couple of years ago. And yeah, I guess in office hours, I see we're short on time, but I could talk more about what are the things that people are actually doing in the nuclear space, because it's kind of unusually hard to know how you would make progress there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think for a few of the other questions we had, people are wondering, I guess, about sources for some of the information you had. For example, the calculation from how much CO2 emissions a donation to climate advocacy can prevent, and then also some other areas like deworming that I don't think came up in the presentation. If people are looking for more information, or even just to kind of access the images or charts or data from your presentation for their own purposes, how should they best go about that?
Yeah, so what you should do is go to longview.org, and then if you click in the little menu button in the top right, you see a bunch of pages, and there'll be this menu item which says, what if the 1% gave 10%? And if you click on that, then you'll be able to see the talk, but also if you scroll down, you'll be able to see a link to this report that we put together. And if you click on that, then that's like a 50-page PDF, and that should have all the citations. But if there's a citation which you feel like is missing or you want to know more, then you can just email me and I should be able to find it.
Great, amazing. And Finn will be having office hours in 10 minutes, but thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Finn, and for all the research and work you're doing. Yeah, I imagine there's probably a lot of additional questions that can come out during office hours. So you can meet Finn over in the other room for that in just a few minutes. But thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.